You know the nightmare. You're back in high school, walking to class, when you notice suddenly that everyone you pass along the way is staring at you. And then they start pointing at you and laughing at you. So you look down at yourself to see what's going on, and you discover that you're completely naked. Or maybe for you, you're giving a really important speech before a large audience, or walking down the aisle in a wedding ceremony and all eyes are on you. You know, those times when you least want to be naked. But these types of situations don't just happen in nightmares. Unintended wardrobe malfunctions happen in real life every now and then. And the more important and intimidating the setting, the more devastating and therefore more memorable the malfunction. Now, if I had to imagine the absolute worst places to be caught naked, the White House would definitely be somewhere near the top of that list. There are several well-known stories about Winston Churchill's relaxed relationship with clothing. One of the most popular took place while he was staying at the White House during World War II, when President Roosevelt accidentally walked in on the Prime Minister standing naked in the Rose Room after getting out of the bath. But this story doesn't quite illustrate the level of Churchill's aversion to clothing in quite the same way as the stories of the White House staff who waited on him every day during his visits. While most of us picture the former Prime Minister sporting a hat, jacket, and cane, the White House staff remembered Churchill in precisely two states of dress while staying at the White House. One was in his hideous one-piece coveralls, and the other was completely naked. Winston Churchill was just one of many international leaders to visit the United States and consequently the White House during World War II. And there is one thing that's sure to happen when you get a bunch of international dignitaries and their staff under the same large roof. Someone is going to unintentionally see someone else naked, which is how the next two stories came to be. Joseph Lash, Executive Secretary of the American Student Union, was like a son to Eleanor Roosevelt. For years, he slept in a small bedroom across from the president's study during his frequent travels to Washington, D.C. When Mr. Lash was in town, Mrs. Roosevelt made a habit of peeking her head into his room to say good morning and good night. Because the Roosevelts had overnight visitors so frequently, sometimes the staff had to make special last-minute arrangements to accommodate everyone. And unfortunately, Mrs. Roosevelt was not always informed of these changes. On one such occasion, Martha, Crown Princess of Norway, had come to stay at the White House with one of her gentlemen-in-waiting. Without the First Lady's knowledge, Mr. Lash had been moved out of his room in order to accommodate Princess Martha's gentleman friend. Late that evening, when the First Lady came home from a long train ride, she knocked on the young Mr. Lash's bedroom door before casually entering to say goodnight, as she often did. But rather than a studious Mr. Lash, the First Lady found herself face to face with the princess's completely naked male traveling companion. A mortified Mrs. Roosevelt made sure that in the future no guest accommodations were made without her prior knowledge and approval. While visiting the United States in 1943, the First Lady of the Republic of China, Madame Chiang Kai-shek, Sung Mei-ling, accompanied by a small entourage of aides, stayed at the White House for 9 days. With her were two top aides believed to be her nephews. When a valet was sent to help the nephews unpack and get settled into their respective rooms, he was made suddenly aware that one of Sung Mei-ling's nephews was in fact not a nephew at all, but a niece, a female, naked from head to toe. Because she was dressed in a more masculine style, she had been mistaken as a male during the group's busy arrival. At first sight of the unclothed female guest, the mortified valet immediately left the room and headed straight to the chief usher's office to explain what happened and send an apologetic maid back to the niece's room in his place. Fast forward about 50 years. Boris Yeltsin was the first democratically elected president of Russia following the fall of the Soviet Union. In 1994, during his second visit to the White House, President Yeltsin was apprehended by White House security when he was seen just outside the White House, unclothed and drunk as a skunk, trying to hail a cab to take him to get a pizza. This, unfortunately, wasn't the only time President Yeltsin was caught wandering the grounds without his clothes or sobriety intact. Luckily, the White House staff had plenty of experience dealing with similar situations. Not every tale of White House nudity ends in embarrassment. Some are simply about real people having a little good, clean fun, even if they happen to live at the nation's most revered address. Now, the White House did not have a swimming pool until 1933, when FDR was president. Until then, presidents who fancied a nice swim now and then had to get creative. If you've spent much time in Washington, D.C., you know that the Potomac River is walking distance from the White House, an even shorter walk before the existence of the buildings, streets, and security that surround it today. I suppose that's why it made the cut for at least 2 former presidents, the first of whom was former President John Quincy Adams. Just before the president would jump in the river, he would strip down to his birthday suit, leaving his clothes on the riverbank. And here's the best part of the story, which is probably part folklore and part truth. When on the riverbank immediately following one of his swims, the president met with Anne Royal, the first female White House reporter. The meeting might have never happened had the enterprising young woman not been sitting on top of the naked president's dry clothes upon the president's return. The other president fond of skinny dipping in the Potomac was avid outdoorsman Theodore Roosevelt. Like other politicians who might like to build working relationships while taking part in commonly enjoyed athletic pastimes like golf or hunting, Roosevelt was no different. He often invited others in the executive branch to take part in his swims. In fact, the Forest Service chief was known to join the president now and then. On one such occasion, as the two placed their dry clothing upon the riverbank, they convinced the French ambassador who had tagged along with them that day to do the same and jump in the river with them. Apparently, it took some coaxing to get the more modest ambassador out of his dry clothes and into the water. Even then, the ambassador refused to remove his kidskin gloves in the event they might meet ladies. Why, of all pieces of clothing, he thought his kidskin gloves were most essential is beyond me. Although none of my sources mentioned how exactly the ambassador wore the gloves either. After Teddy's younger cousin Franklin Delano Roosevelt built the first White House swimming pool, he invited several congressional Democrats to the White House for a stag party at which various sporting events were enjoyed, including skinny dipping. Luckily, they no longer had to walk to the Potomac. A few decades later, President Kennedy and his brothers Bobby and Teddy were known to jump into the very same pool without their trunks on occasion. And it wasn't uncommon for advisors and staffers to join them. But my favorite presidential skinny dipping story involves, surprise, surprise, President Johnson. During his years in the White House, LBJ would sometimes, in the middle of the workday, ask if anyone felt like taking a swim with him, something he rarely did with his trunks on. According to authors Nancy Gibbs and Michael Duffy, Johnson once invited Reverend Billy Graham to the White House, where the two gentlemen shared a prayer and a nice dip in the pool. Both of them wearing nothing but what the good Lord gave 'em.